All right, welcome to our Monday Mom at Home session. We are having an exciting time today, Museum Monday, if you will. And for every Museum Monday, we have our very well knowledgeable, educated. He's got a doctorate, right? Doctorate. Or I'm not making things up, but he's our manager of collections and artifacts, Mr. Jonathan Piper, and he's going to be sharing today all about synthesizers, and it actually coordinates with our special exhibition. So without further ado, Dr. Piper, if you please.
Well, thank you, BJ, for that introduction. Like you mentioned, this ties in with our special exhibition a little bit. Right now, we have music from the sound up, the creative tools of synthesis in our special exhibition gallery. It's a really wonderful interactive exhibition, and it made me a little sad that it's not in use at the moment. So I kind of wanted synthesizers a little bit, because we were trying in that exhibition to shine a light on a whole class of instruments that sometimes gets overlooked or gets lumped into the generic category of keyboards, like a lot of the instruments behind me. And so I wanted to take today to maybe try to get at that a little bit, kind of picking things apart a little bit. You know, if we can't get hands-on with Mom at Home, at least I can talk about it, something, I guess. So starting from the beginning, I'm going to try to run through a little bit, talk about concepts of synthesis, where we came from, how we got to here, and then do a little bit of a demo, talk a little bit about concepts in synthesis, and hear that on an actual synthesizer, a good way to end. So if we pick apart the word synthesis, it's pulling things together to make something, making something from a lot of component pieces. So what that really entails is, in the world of synthesizers, a lot of electronic components that come together to produce a sound. The very first thing that we start with is a circuit that oscillates, that kind of goes over and over again and produces a pitch, a frequency. So if you think about, you've probably heard, 120 hertz AC, or it was a 60 hertz at 120 volts. So that 60 hertz is a frequency. It's a cycle of power. Just like the A440 in orchestral music is the 440 hertz of the middle C. So it's not a huge leap to go from the cyclicity of electricity to the cyclicity of sound. So if you can get an electrical current going at a certain rate, you can make sound out of it. And so scientists were experimenting with that. Was that a question, BJ?
Well, I was just the cyclicity of electricity. That's my next band name that I'm going to adopt. I'm taking that and trademarking it.
Perfect. It's my gift to you.
Thank you.
So people were experimenting with this, creating circuits to generate sound, back in the mid 19th century. It wasn't really until a device called the electric telegram that allowed people to transmit sound via an electronic circuit over a distance. So then you have people experimenting with other ways to generate sound electronically, like the big Telharmonium, which was an experiment to create basically a building-sized instrument that could be played and could transmit sound by telephone wire, through an entire city. So you could pick up your telephone receiver, if you were lucky enough to have one, and listen to somebody playing an instrument. But then you get into the 1908, the invention of the amplifying vacuum tube, the Audion. And so finally, you had a way to amplify that sound so you didn't have to transmit it to a telephone, you could just amplify it right in a space. And then you have the ability to start to bring things together where you have an oscillator, which is, again, that circuit that produces the frequency with an amplifier, and then other things like ways to control the frequency of the oscillator or ways to change the sound of the oscillator. And so all of these components start coming together. And the first big landmark instrument is the Theremin in the 1920s, where you have kind of this dream of a new possible instrument. where you have, there's no keyboard, there's no valve like on a brass instrument, there's nothing traditionally associated with music making. It's antennae that control the pitch and the amplitude, so the frequency and the volume of an oscillator, all in one self-contained unit. And then that keeps on growing and progressing. People try to mate this brand new technology onto existing instruments. Like Hammond created the Nova chord, which takes the form of the Hammond B3, which we're going to learn all about later this week, but connects it to hundreds and hundreds of vacuum tubes with a polyphonic synthesizer to try to, again, take the new technology, fit it to something existing that people might be familiar with. And of course, nobody liked the end result of the Nova chord, didn't go anywhere. But people kept kind of going through that process of taking something new, can this fit into something old? And that relationship between the old and the new has been really, really interesting as we've gone through the history of synthesizers. As a circuit question?
Sorry, as you're describing kind of the history of this, it reminds me too of like the relationship when computers were first invented, the huge ENIAC, and then the size comparisons, how they kind of went from these massive monstrosities to smaller and smaller configurations. Is this kind of parallel with that, with the technology? I don't know if it was hand in hand or if it was maybe kind of along the same timeline. Is that related?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you think about the ENIAC or some of those other very early computers, they took up the size of a warehouse or a very large room because they were all based on vacuum tube technology. If you haven't seen a vacuum tube, it's a device usually somewhere around from there to there, sometimes bigger, but they're logic gates. They allow current to flow. And if you want to create something that can add a couple of numbers together, you need a lot of those. So shortly after the ENIAC, shortly after people figure out how to do this sort of stuff, they come up with a transistor. And suddenly you can do that logic, the on or off, in something that's about that big. And then people figure out how to combine those things together into one chip. So suddenly you have something that is as powerful or more powerful than the ENIAC, in a space this big. And then all of a sudden you end up with your smartphone, which is orders of magnitude more powerful than the ENIAC, and it fits in your pocket. So with a synthesizer, if you look at something like the Theremin, which is a monophonic synth, it produces one note at a time. And the early models were a piece of furniture. They were fairly sizable. And then you go to something like the Nova chord, which was a fully polyphonic synthesizer that weighs something like 650 pounds. And it's like feet deep. It's a massive instrument. But then you get to instruments like the ones behind me, where you get the functionality of those instruments, but in a much smaller package. And then of course now you can buy an app on your phone for a couple bucks, and you get all the functionality of those instruments in something that is also multi-purpose, that does all these other different things.
Right. And or have like an entire suite of software that fits, is weightless and it fits on your laptop computer or your desktop. Almost that an entire wall represented behind you is now coded and programmed anymore sometimes.
Right. So what's amazing is shortly after or shortly before the development of the transistor, invention in the late 40s and really popularization in the late 50s, synthesizers were getting so big because they were kind of going in two different directions. There was the synth technology for consumers, which was kind of stagnating, but then synth technology for researchers and serious composers and people who were trying to pick apart sound. And those machines were getting massive, kind of culminating with the RCA Mark II synthesizer, which was installed at Columbia, I believe. And it took up an entire room because it was just racks and racks of equipment for making sound. And every single component was its own individual box, and they all fit together in specific ways, and only something like a trained number of people had access to it, because it took so much knowledge to even start making sound on it. And then of course you couldn't save your settings, so you had to record everything that you did so that you can come back to it tomorrow and hopefully make the same sound again. Huge, massive physical dimensions for a fairly restricting piece of technology. But then shortly after that, as the transistor emerges, as integrated circuits start happening, something with the power of the RCA Mark II starts getting smaller and smaller. Eventually, you end up with something like the mini Moog, where you have an oscillator bank, you have a filter bank, you have an envelope generator, you have all these different ways to shape your sound, combined with a mini keyboard, and it's something that fits on a desktop or that you can carry to a gig with you. So suddenly, the synthesizer becomes something that normal musicians might want to use. Finally, that's kind of when the synth arrives as a thing that really has a big impact on popular music, like an immediately recognizable impact on popular music. And people look at that and think, that's an instrument that I might want to have. And then you go from there into instruments that start adding in saving functionality, like the OB1 and the Prophet 5 above me, that integrate some memory technology. You don't have to write everything down. You can just hit save. It'll save some settings for you.
Now, was that the principle behind, like, if you had to go to a gig and somebody accidentally, messed up your, one of the 1,000 knobs on the, the Moog synthesizer, was that what they had? Would they had, a sheet of paper where all the settings were marked down? What was that like?
Yeah, so either, marking like with tape or grease pencil on the machine itself, or meticulous records of everything. Because the amazing thing about synthesizers is they can make just about any sound that you want them to make, which is extremely powerful. But it's also a real difficulty. Not only do you always have this blank canvas staring at you, where it's as if if you can make any sound, it's hard to think of what sound to make. But also, if you lose your setting, if you lose your sound, it can be really, really difficult to get it back. As these machines get more and more complex with more and more capabilities, you have to remember more and more settings. So the save functionality, it's a game changer. If you're a composer and you're doing this stuff in advance, if you want to record something, or if you want to get back to a sound and tweak it ever so slightly, you got to remember your settings. If you're a gigging musician and you have a specific sound for a tune, you've got to remember your settings. When that memory function starts to come into synths, total game changer.
Now, we did have a question from one of the viewers, Brian, who's been, I think he's been at almost every single one of our Mom at Home sessions. He wanted to know, was the Moog a hybrid or all based on transistors? Now, I'm not sure the answer myself, but maybe you can kind of clarify or shed some light on that.
So my understanding, I haven't opened one up myself. So unfortunately, I don't have a perfect answer. But my understanding is it would have been based on transistors. If there are any tubes, it would have been at the output stage. Can't speak authoritatively to that, unfortunately. That's a great question. I'm going to find out as soon as this is done, because I wish I knew the answer to that one.
And then I think I was corrected. Michael says it's pronounced Moog, not Moog. Moog, not Moog. I think, which one is the correct pronunciation? Just to set everybody straight.
Moog. Straight from the horse's mouth. Moog. Looks like Moog, but pronounced Moog.
Sounds great. All right, what else can you kind of share with us about how synthesizers work, a little history, and then how they actually create sound? I know we're going to touch on that a little bit today, because we're going to explore also how our special exhibition kind of showcases how synthesizers work and how they create sound.
Sure. So, like I mentioned, the memory technology of the OB1, the Prophet 5, which allowed you to recall settings, it didn't, technology moves at such a fast pace that, it's not long before the same memory function that allows you to store some settings allows you to store sounds, entire sounds. So you start ending up with devices that can actually record sound onto a microprocessor or memory chip, and then those sounds can be played back and manipulated directly, in the circuit. You don't actually have to, bring in settings. You don't have to manipulate your oscillator or your envelope or your filter. You have the sound recorded, and then you can manipulate it farther from that. So that again is a massive game changer, where you have things like the EMU here, the Roland D50, the Korg Korg M1, which are machines where you can record into memory and then manipulate what you have recorded, or things like the Kurzweil K250, which with a really complicated combination of sampling sounds and then software algorithms that manipulate the sampling, you can get extremely close approximations of acoustic instruments, but in a synthesizer format, basically.
I've got a quick question though, but from myself. Mr. Bill and I were exploring MIDI, I think a few weeks ago, and how many of the synthesizers do we have behind you right now that are MIDI capable? And do you know? I'm not sure if this is an appropriate question, but do you know if the MIDI capable synthesizers, if you can alter the sound using MIDI signals as well?
So to the first question about which of these have MIDI in them, a number of them do. MIDI, of course, comes along after synths really start to become this big commercial item. So the older synths like our ARP 2600, the OB1, the Prophet 5 are not going to have MIDI capabilities. But the one that really changed everything is the DX7 right here, which in addition to being the first really successful and affordably priced FM synthesizer, also has MIDI capabilities. In terms of being able to manipulate your sound via MIDI, that really comes down to the specific instrument and the implementation of MIDI and the implementation of the controls around the synthesizer. If your synthesizer is built so that it can receive an incoming digital signal and then translate that into a corresponding frequency of your oscillator, or frequency cutoff of your filter, or the sustain level of your envelope generator, whatever it is. If your implementation can handle that, by all means, you can be playing something on one keyboard that is then sending MIDI signals to your synthesizer and manipulating the synth sound entirely through MIDI. And we actually do, some of that in the special exhibition room, where we're using a lot, some MIDI to control what's actually happening in the synthesizer. So there's a lot of crossover there, a lot of like co-developed capabilities.
Very, very cool. Thanks for bringing that to light.
Sure. And so I did mention the FM synthesis on the DX7. Pretty shortly after computer technology became something accessible to researchers, people tried to figure out how to use computers to make sound. And you go all the way back to the 1950s, people are using computer programs to create sound out of nothing, and this is called digital synthesis. Digital synthesis is extremely resource intensive for those early computers. It's the kind of thing where you punch in some parameters, wait for the computer to generate it, and then it plays the sound back for you. And a lot of this, again, is just based on purely manipulating the signal that the computer is generating. Extremely difficult to do. It's the realm of very select few researchers who specifically know about computers and really know about the deep science of acoustics. One of those people happened to be Dr. John Chowning, working up at Stanford, and through the, I believe, 60s and into the 60s, he patents the FM synthesis algorithm. FM synthesis, or frequency modulation synthesis, is a way of combining multiple signals together, modulating one with another, where you can start to create really, really rich sounds that can start to mimic some acoustic instruments. He patents this. I believe it was the first IP owned by Stanford, and it has been the most lucrative IP owned by Stanford since. Because as soon as Yamaha licensed the IP of FM synthesis and started producing it in things like the DX7 and this beautiful GS2 that we have, it really took off because it was this way to create sounds that you just couldn't create on these other, the analog synths. It opened up a whole new world in digital synthesis. And again, it's something that you can do on your iPhone now, or your a plug-in for your favorite DAW or something. It's become part of the toolkit, I guess, but it was this massive shift in capability for synthesizers in the early 80s.
Right, and that that reminded me too with one of the whom I consider the unsung heroes in the synthesizer world are the folks who actually go in and program a lot of the presets that come, factory direct. If you're getting a Moog Mini or a Moog Voyager, it has just a ton of already preset sounds built into the memory banks of that instrument. And not oftentimes you get to you think about like who actually concocted all of these presets and programmed them in there. That's a lot of work to get all these sounds in there.
It really is. I mean, especially with the DX7, which includes an interface to program it, but it's exceptionally difficult to program. And so most people who play it end up using just one of the presets. And those presets were programmed by just a couple of people. And people using brand new technology in this kind of confusing language of operators and modulators and carrier signals and all these different things. And they programmed these sounds that ended up becoming kind of the bedrock of so much music in the 1980s, because the DX7 dropped and it was only a few $1,000s and everybody bought them and then didn't really know how to program them. So they just were already there. So like the music of the 1980s is the sound of the DX7. And those people who programmed those initial sounds, don't get a whole lot of that credit.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, it was quite a foundation. Maybe they didn't realize it at the time what they were getting themselves into, but yeah, a lot of those presets. And again, I'm going to go back to my drummer roots. We're the first ones to say, I can't figure out how to work this thing. Just give me the presets and go. Well, what else? Do we want to shift now into actually how synthesizers work, or do you have a little bit more history for us? Is there anything that brings it up to the modern era?
Well, I mean, once we get here, we're basically looking at bringing everything together.
Mm-hmm.
So a single synth or a single synth patch or VST plugin, whatever it is, that can mimic an analog waveform generator, that can mimic sampling plus manipulation, that can do FM synthesis, and then ways to get like the Roland guitar synthesizer here, which is the one instrument that we're featuring here that does not use a keyboard interface. Because if you think about it, a keyboard is really just a way of telling the synthesizer which pitch to play. It's a really familiar and intuitive interface for delineating multiple different pitches. But there's no reason why you can't interpret the signal coming out of a guitar string and turn that into the pitch information that goes into the synthesizer. In the special exhibition room, we have a guitar pickup that turns all of your guitar signals into MIDI notes that can then go into the synthesizer and play your notes. We've got a theremin that converts the pitch of the theremin into MIDI, which then goes into the synthesizer. We've got an Ableton Push, which is just a grid of buttons, which then turn into MIDI and goes into the synthesizer. So a lot of development there, trying to get instruments, non-keyboard instruments, to work as intuitively, as directly as a keyboard interface. Things like the EWI, where you have a wind instrument and, based on wind pressure and, the bend and how you're contacting the mouthpiece and how you're pressing the keys, that will turn into MIDI, which will then control your synthesizer.
Well, so, even the Moog Theremin, or even going earlier than Theremin, wouldn't that be considered a type of synthesizer that uses the same technology that a synthesizer roughly uses?
For sure. Again, going back to the Theremin in the 1920s, that was basically laying the groundwork for a lot of the synthesis technology to come. And it's funny you mentioned that. Bob Moog got his start making and selling kits to create theremins. The theremin had kind of gone out of popularity 30s and 40s, and then kind of came back a little bit as a kit. And then Bob Moog, of course, goes on to translate the knowledge that he gains there and launches a really successful company that changed the way we make music.
Yeah, absolutely. And I believe the kits are still available today. I think there's also kits that you can buy for even if you wanted to do like a Raspberry Pi based theremin. I think you can find the technology out there, open source technology or commercially pre-built technology. It's pretty amazing what they're still doing with the foundations of the synth technology based upon the original, Leon Theremin's instrument, and then Bob Moog's work with that instrument as well.
Yeah, I mean, and you mentioned Raspberry Pi. I mean, our special exhibition is built on Raspberry Pis. We have a software synth engine developed by Dr. Chris Warren over at San Diego State It's running on a $35 computer. And then I built some little interfaces, buttons and knobs and sliders that all goes into the Raspberry Pi and controls the synthesizer engine. It's really incredible how much the technology has opened up, how affordable it is to get into it if you want to devote an afternoon to learning how to put a synth together. I mean, you can. Grab an open source generator, put it on a Raspberry Pi for 35 bucks, and add some sensors. You can use a proximity sensor to emulate the Theremin functionality. You can use knobs and sliders to do all kinds of wacky things. There's no limit to what you can build using that foundational technology. So why don't we actually hear some synthesizer?
Yeah, that's why I'm here. I just came for the synth demonstration.
I've been blabbing for 25 minutes now. Nobody's here to stop me, I guess. So over here, I wanted to demonstrate, I think this is going to be a little bit more translatable to this format than actually walking through the synth exhibition.
And this is the museum's interactive room.
Yeah, and this is one of our newer additions. This is the Korg Monologue, which is a monophonic analog synth, which really gives a great way of kind of just getting your head around how synthesizers are working. So I'm going to turn this on, and I'm just going to play a note on an oscillator. So this is just one note playing on an oscillator, and that oscillator is going on a sine wave. So a sine wave, if you remember from geometry class or trigonometry, is just a really simple wave that goes up and down very smoothly. So at the most basic level, I can control the shape of that oscillator to change the sound that I'm getting. So
sounds like my early speak and spell when I was a kid growing up.
Yeah, sine waves are fairly simple to make, and it has that kind of classic computery technology sound. If we change the waveform, we start to get different sounds. So this is a sawtooth wave. So it has more of a buzzy sound, a little bit more aggressive. We can also do a square wave, which is kind of a cross between the two. There's a little bit of a buzz to it, but there's still kind of the openness of the sine wave. I like that, so I'm going to stick with that. What we can then do is start to add some filtering, and filtering is basically just deciding which frequencies get through and which frequencies don't get through. In our exhibition, we use the metaphor of a sieve. So if you're pouring your pasta through a colander, the pasta stays behind, the water dumps out. A sieve kind of works, a filter kind of works in the same way that you allow certain filters to pass through the filter. So if you think of your sound as being this sort of complex group of frequencies, but you have a block here, this is your filter, only this much is going to get through. So you can let high frequencies get through, or low frequencies get through, or mid frequencies get through. So I'm going to try to do a little bit of filtering here. So as I let through more sound, it gets brighter, and there it goes until we don't hear anything anymore because no sound is getting through at this point. Also a function of the filter called resonance. And if I turn that up, you start to get the filter basically resonating itself. And you can get sorts of interesting effects with the resonance on the filter. But here, right, we've already gone from a very simple wave into something that's starting to get a little bit more complicated. We can then start to add an envelope to the sound. We can do an on-off, but we can also, so an envelope is basically the shape of the sound over time. So if we do this again, this on-off, that's not a very natural sound. There aren't a whole lot of sounds in nature that are just on-off. So if you want to start to shape that a little bit, I can make the attack a little bit softer. And there with that tone, you almost get like a clarinet kind of a sound.
Right, yeah.
With that little bit of an onset from the breath and then the vibration of the reed. And then we can also change the decay. So if you think of an instrument like a guitar, which is going to have a pretty quick attack but then the string will resonate for a while, we can start to do something like that. What's really great about the envelope is that the envelope doesn't just have to be attached to the volume of the sound. We can also attach an envelope to pitch so that the pitch can follow that same contour of rising, sustaining, and falling. Kind of a funny sound.
Yeah,
but
that's great. Actually, save that one for me. I'm going to use that later.
So there are all kinds of different ways that we can start to manipulate that sound. But where synthesizers become really, really fun is when you start to combine things together. Again, this idea of synthesis, making something out of many things. So this has a second oscillator on it that we can start to pull in to change the sound and make it more complicated. So I'm going to stay there with this one, and I'm going to pull up the volume of the second oscillator. So now I've got a much more complex, rich tone, and I can change the shape of that new oscillator's wave from a sawtooth to a sine to noise. So now I've started to get some very complicated sounds. And again, I can apply my filter. I can change my resonance around. That's kind of nice. I'm going to get rid of that noise, though, because that's starting to bug me. Ooh. And we can detune the oscillators a little bit, which is always kind of fun. And then, when I've got that going, I can apply what's called an LFO, or a low frequency oscillator. And kind of like how an envelope is changing the sound over time, an LFO is basically that, but with another wave. So if we
not to be confused with our LEO, the Live Electronic Orchestra in the museum, or ELO, the Electronic Light Orchestra, correct?
Yeah, pretty different. I'm pretty sure ELO and Leo both use those, but different, sure. Frequency oscillator do is wave the low frequency, so a subsonic frequency. We around 20 to 25 hertz, 20 times per second. So what we can do with it to introduce a auto effect or a wah-wah. I go wow, wow, wow.
Hold on, it looks like we got knocked offline temporarily.
Volume very slow.
Jonathan?
Hold on, it looks like we got knocked. Okay.
Jonathan, are you doing okay over there? I'm having trouble seeing your feed.
Yeah. I'm fine here, and I can see you.
Okay. Okay. I think we're back on.
Back?
Yes. Okay, yes, we're back in action.
Okay. So, if I want to get my wah-wah sound, my wah-wah-wah, I can do that with the LFO. So I'm going to hold my note, and you can start to hear how it's already, there's a bit of a very slow oscillating to it. I can speed up the LFO, and now that starts to become more like a vibrato or a tremolo. And then if I do it fast enough, it becomes its own sound. That now is a sonic wave. It's a wave that we can actually hear, but it's modulating that sound in a way that turns it into something brand new. I can also apply an LFO to the pitch to make it go up and down. Sorry, I've been on a
Yeah,
sawtooth wave.
that's pretty cool.
There we go. That's what I was looking for. There's my sine wave. So you hear that just up and down, up and down. And there it becomes more of a, slow vibrato. That's obviously a very wide vibrato. There we go. A little more subtle. Or we're going back to the tremolo effect. And then because I can use a different wave shape for my LFO, I can get different sounds. Like that's just up and down, up and down, up and down. And then again, based on how I combine those, I can get some really cool effects. I like this one a lot. It starts to sound pretty complex. That sounds pretty good to me.
That's very spooky.
So with all of these different combinations of what are effectively just devices that go up and down, that generate waves, based on how we control those and combine them, we can get all kinds of different sounds coming out of a synthesizer like this. Again, the technology has advanced to such a profound degree that you can get something like this pretty affordably if you're interested in starting out with synths. Or again, if you're more of a software person, pick up a Raspberry Pi for $35, build a synth. It really is kind of amazing how capable they are, how flexible they are. They're not just keyboards. They're not just new wave music from the 80s. They're just profoundly flexible instruments that operate, again, on some really basic fundamental concepts. Generate a wave, shape the wave in time somehow, combine waves together.
Absolutely. And for anybody looking to explore synthesizers and synthesis, yeah, you just gave them some good alternatives if it's a software-based synthesizer, hardware-based synthesizer. You could probably get your hands on one by going to an app store for your mobile device and, downloading whatever's available. I know that many of the companies, either they give you a free trial or there's, you can get them for a couple bucks anymore. But yeah, try your hand at it, and then come visit the museum when we get our synth exhibition ready again to open to the public, and explore how you can create your own sound there.
Yeah, super fun. I mean, they can be intimidating, but there's no reason to be afraid of synthesizers. They can't hurt you. They can only make sound. I think a lot of people would be surprised at how expressive they can be, how musical they can be. At the end of the day, they are tools for making music. They are not tools to replace musicians. They're not tools to somehow to make music robotic or programmatic or computerized. They're more tools to make great music with.
That will be that's a wonderful parting thought you just had. Just synthesizers can't hurt you. So we'll put that on a t-shirt and get that ready. All right. Anything else? Any final thoughts before we head out for today?
I think that's what I got in half an hour. But if anybody has any questions, shoot me an email, jonathanp@museumofmakingmusic.org. Happy to talk synths more, nerd out on it a little bit. And yeah, hope everybody enjoyed the presentation.
Absolutely. And if you want to learn more about the museum's special exhibition and how synthesizers build sound, you can also visit our website, www.museumofmakingmusic.org. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, we're on Instagram, and you can also get heads up when more of our Mom at Home episodes will be taking place. We're doing them daily through the rest of this week, and then if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, you'll be able to get updates there as well. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day, and we hope to see you back tomorrow on Mom at Home when we speak with a musical arranger. Let's see, and learn more about what a musical arranger does. Until then, we'll see you later.